You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. This show is dedicated to the memory of Bill, a friend of our patron Christopher Ford. And Christopher would like to encourage you to do something nice for someone else. So if everyone in the community could do that, we'd consider it a favour to Chris and Bill. I'm your host, Richard Reddy, and today we have a packed magazine show. We've got tech from the greatest tech man in F1 journalism. It is Matthew Somerfield, Summers F1, joining Matt Trumpets, and we'll be putting your questions to F1 strategist Mike Caulfield. And to end the show, I'll be asking Brad Philpot a seemingly simple question, which is it harder to drive a race car than it is to drive a go-kart? Now, I'm assuming the answer is yes, but the journey to getting there will be fascinating. Now, normally, I put the tech at the end of the show, because then it's like stirring in broccoli into the kids' lasagna. But I'm a veteran dad now. I've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and things moved on. My tactic with them for the last 4 or 5 years has been to say, hey, listen, I don't like the veg either. Eat the veg first, and then you can get to the good stuff. And over time, you know what? They figured out the veg is the good stuff. So that's why we're putting the tech up front. Don't worry, it's only half an hour. Then I'll be back with all the strategy and the race car stuff with Brad. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Trumpet and Summers for some tech.
It's time for tech, and once again, our presence is graced by the hardest working man in tech F1, Matthew Somerfield, aka Summers F1, who is technical editor at motorsport.com. It's good to see you again. Thanks for taking the time.
No worries, Matt. It's been a hot minute since we last spoke, and there's obviously a lot gone on in between, so good to be back, and thanks for having me on.
Of course. And I would like to dive right into our topics today. And I know there's going to be lots of flexi floor questions and brake dust questions, but I want to talk about Mercedes because I learned a minor fact about them at the last race, which is that because they both cleverly crashed their cars in qualifying, they had to split up their single remaining floor amongst the two cars. How much do you think that affected them during the race? Or do you think maybe Mercedes has learned something new and interesting from this experiment?
Well, I think one of the things that perhaps hasn't come across in great detail so far this season is the vast size of the floor is sometimes considered to be a little bit problematic for the teams in terms of development. So what a lot of the teams are doing this year is they're using sort of like a patchwork quilt effect. So the floor itself, you know, you've got the main part of the floor, but then you've got individual parts of it that can be interchanged with one another in order to, you know, drive development forward without having to build an entirely new floor structure for each race or, you know, each development. So from a cost cap point of view, that's obviously quite beneficial. But from a racing point of view, it has indeed added some weight to the floors. And we have seen some of the teams making gains in that respect. Now, in terms of what Mercedes did with their sort of let's patch two floors together scenario, they obviously had quite a bit of damage to those two floors. And as we saw with their rear wing scenario, they're not all the teams are not kind of carrying the full quantity of parts through the course of the races because of the cost cap. So there's lots of things going on in the background for teams to try to save money and also to try to gain performance.
Okay, well, happily, I am not the only person fascinated by Mercedes. One question I do want to ask is that this was not supposed to be a track that favored them. And yet we saw, at least by my calculations, they were within about 3.5 tenths or so on Lewis's car, which was carrying the proper rear wing for this particular setup. Are they back in the picture? I mean, and what have they done that has brought them back? Because they were very inconsistent, and now suddenly they seem 2 races on the bounce to be back in the picture.
Well, I think amongst the vast array of updates that we saw at Silverstone, perhaps the biggest batch of upgrades that we've seen for the entire season from almost every single team. Mercedes probably had one of the largest packages of parts. So front to rear, there's lots of things going on with that car that they've tried to really optimize their performance based on what they found in the opening part of the season. As we know, they went on to do a lot of development work with both cars to understand what was going on with the porpoising and the bouncing, and then try to get the best from the package with those issues in tow. So we've seen them change quite a few components. And on top of that, I think they've just got a better operating window with the car now. One thing that I do think that is perhaps holding them back, though, is the way in which they work their tyres. You do see throughout the course of a stint that they tend to be very slow in the opening phase because they just can't warm up the tyres. And then as they build into the race, they become much stronger compared to their rivals because they're starting to deg before Mercedes are. So there's sort of a bit of an offset there with the tyres and performance.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting point. And to that point, because I was going to ask, is the warm-up a fundamental issue, or is it perhaps a strategic choice? Because in the past, certainly Mercedes has been plagued by degradation issues. Is this just an overcorrection, or is this it's going to always be a bit of that choice for any team under this regulation set?
I think Mercedes kind of built that into this car from the start. I think if you look back at the earlier races, they also struggled with tyre warm-up. It's not something that's really been corrected or caused a more of a problem with just this upgrade. It's something that they've always had. It's just that the upgrade has kind of brought them further forward into the field, and now everybody can really see where that tyre deg is starting to pay off in terms of the problem that they have at the start of a stint, but then the better longevity that they have on the tyre.
Okay, well, we have some specific listener questions. Cabilo Cello wants to know if Mercedes are running their cars at lower power modes compared to Red Bull and Ferrari, and what difference it might make if they were to turn that power unit up. And Graham Patmore is also interested, but he's hearing things about the rear suspension and how it's working with the stiff chassis. Have they brought new suspension, and how would it improve what we've seen in the past?
Okay, so going first off with the suspension thing, because I think that's more important in terms of performance directly, what we're seeing on the track. Obviously, Mercedes had a major problem with porpoising and bouncing, and I feel that their rear suspension, more so than the front suspension, was a bit of an issue in this area, and it appears that they have made changes in that respect in order to improve the operating window. Give them more setup options, allow them to run the car in a way which is conducive to getting the level of downforce that they're looking for at the different tracks. And I think that's where they struggled in the opening phase of the season, that they just didn't have enough top end to be able to make these adjustments, and that's why they obviously were struggling with the ill effects of porpoising and bouncing. But in terms of the power unit side of things, and I think this is indicative of not just Mercedes, but obviously their customers as well. What we're seeing is that they are slightly down in terms of performance when you measure them against the other power unit suppliers, but they're also a little bit better when it comes to the degradation of the power unit components. So it's a bit of cat and mouse. They've perhaps lost some performance relative to their rivals, but they're not perhaps going to have to take the penalties that their rivals will do later on in the season.
Yes, I think I saw someone quip at one point, the best ability is reliability. And so that seems to be the course that they've taken.
Yeah, it would appear that way to me, that they just edged their bets onto being better over the course of a season, but that has obviously hampered them in terms of direct performance slightly.
Okay. Now I'm going to take a slightly weird detour, because you mentioned a little bit ago that Mercedes has been working very hard to optimize their setup with what they have, and that's been important. And that weirdly reminds me of Haas, because to my understanding, they've not brought any updates at all, and they've been almost entirely focused on optimizing what they brought at the beginning of the year. And yet we've seen them sort of start out a bit strong, struggle, and now suddenly they have really come on, and especially in Austria. And how exactly, what are they focusing? How are they finding this time without bringing developments while the rest of their rivals are, and yet they're still being successful?
It's a case of perhaps having a good car out of the box, as we saw at the very beginning of the season and certainly in pre-season testing. But then they didn't seem to migrate with the rest of the grid in understanding how to then get the best from the car over the course of the next few races. Since then, we've kind of, as you mentioned, not really seen much from them in terms of development. We've seen the odd rear wing, which is more about circuit specificity, if I can get my words out. But they haven't gone on and changed a huge amount in terms of aerodynamic performance. They've gone on and tried to find performance through setup. And for me, again, it does bleed back towards tyres and what they're able to do on the tyres, both in terms of performance over one lap and also over the course of a race.
Okay, and thank you to Aditya Joshi for that last question. I'd like to move on, unless I've missed anything Mercedes-wise, and talk a little bit about the marquee matchup right now, which is Ferrari versus Red Bull. And it still looks like a concept fight to me. Ferrari have stuck to their higher downforce guns, and Red Bull have worked very hard to develop their slippery but fast concept. So where are we with Ferrari and their development? Are they taking more of a Haas path in terms of taking their time with introductions to save money, or are they kind of like Red Bull, throwing it all against the wall race after race?
No, I mean, Red Bull are literally throwing the kitchen sink at things, as we've seen from them in the past. They are very reliable at that style of development. They will chuck stuff at the car as quickly as possible to try to remedy and then finesse and optimize parts around the car that they feel will give them the biggest advantage in terms of gains. Whereas Ferrari are a bit more methodical in their approach to development. Their car was, as we know, very quick out the box. It perhaps has less of a high ceiling in terms of being able to be developed, but they have bought parts recently that I do believe has made quite a significant difference to them in terms of their fight against Red Bull. The biggest being their new rear wing, which Leclerc had in Canada and has since now found its way onto Sainz's car over the last couple of races. And it gives them more of an offset in terms of DRS versus the wing not being used with DRS. So effectively that improves their qualifying performance, but it doesn't give them a massive deficit in terms of race pace because of the way that wing is designed. In terms of Red Bull, they've tried to do similar, but they haven't done so much with their upper rear wing elements. They've just ditched one of the elements on the beam wing. So there's a lot of work going on between the two in terms of optimization and trying to find performance. But like you say, they are kind of going about it in very different ways. And that might play out in Ferrari's favour as we come towards the end of the season, if we consider the resource restrictions and the cost cap that are also in place.
Well, we actually have a question about that from Phil McWilliams for Ferrari, asking if they're going to have to fix Sainz's car from within the budget cap, or is there perhaps a force majeure clause that in rare circumstances will allow the team to take a different budget?
No, they'll have to fix that within the scope of the cost cap. And obviously, it was a significant amount of damage, just as the crash for Zhou was at Silverstone. That more so is problematic because of what happened with the roll structure and the monocoque in terms of the damage there. But these are the scenarios that obviously play out within Formula One, and all of the teams have to work this into their budgets. Ferrari, unfortunately, do appear to have had more damage compared to Red Bull, which, when you think about it, that is going to play against their development budget. So, it's, again, that's why we're seeing a difference between them in terms of what they're putting onto their car, because they're having to factor this in to being under the budget cap come the end of the season.
Yes. Well, imagine if Maldonado was still driving. I think Williams would have to retire for the season at this point.
Yeah, it could be quite costly, couldn't it? We've had this discussion. Matt's had this discussion in the past, Matthew Carter, when he had two certain drivers at Lotus. And you just think about the impact that damage can have on a season and the cost involved.
Right. Well, I think one of the interesting things for everybody was in Austria specifically was how far off, how badly Red Bull really just seemed to miss the mark. I mean, even when they haven't been as fast as Ferrari, they haven't been as slow as they were. at this specific track. So what do you think happened? And in fact, Joe would like to know specifically, what did Red Bull change that screwed up their tire degradation in Austria? So thank you for mentioning tires there, Joe.
I think it's a combination of factors. I think we've got obviously track conditions. We've got the tyres themselves. Remembering the compounds that we're running at, we have 5 specific compounds, and obviously we had the softest 3 compounds available in Austria. We have the consideration of the variables around tyres, such as the minimum tyre pressures, which has an impact on how you operate the car. And then I think you've also got to factor in that perhaps Red Bull went to try to defend against Ferrari in some respects. This is a tactical battle that we've seen in the past with Red Bull and Mercedes. We've just kind of seen a switch around this season in many ways, in that Ferrari have taken Mercedes' place and now they're trying to fight against one another. So they make changes to the car to suit how they're going to fight their rival, rather than just perhaps getting on with their own job at hand. And that is perhaps where Red Bull fell into a bit of trap here at Austria. But we have to remember that certain cars will just be better at certain circuits, and perhaps this particular track, altitude as well, remember, is a factor at this particular track, being 700 metres above sea level. Perhaps that might have played into Ferrari's hands versus Red Bull on this particular occasion.
Right. So would I be wrong then in assuming that, for all intents and purposes, developments aside, that the 2 cars are more or less equal, and that on any given weekend it's going to come down to, does one track suit one car, and does one team really just nail the setup on relative to the other?
Yeah, I do feel like that they are pretty much on par with one another. I know that, during the races we see AWS's version of how the performances increase throughout the course of the season, and it appears that they always have Ferrari at the top. Well, I would gamble to say that perhaps Red Bull have the better car overall, rather than Ferrari, but they are very nip and tuck. And as you say, it comes down to multiple variables at the particular circuit, and obviously which driver has a better command of the car during that race weekend. It's been nip and tuck in occasions between Sainz and Leclerc, going through different sessions, and that's another thing. How they learn throughout the course of the practice sessions can also be a considerable benefit from one car or one garage side to the other in getting the best from the car.
Right. Now, one thing that I did hear across the course of the weekend was that the Red Bull Ring is a bit more of a rear limited circuit, and that benefited because of the way Ferrari chose to run their car. That tended to benefit Ferrari more than Red Bull. And so, in a sense, it's like an axle battle, rear axle versus front axle. And our listener, Fragel, would like to know, what is the best publicly available resource of front rear limited tracks and front rear limited drivers and cars? And I have yet to find it, but if you know of one, now would be the time.
The answer to that question is, I don't think there's anywhere out there that has that available as information. Just to give you an idea, or at least Max's interpretation of the RB18 is that he is limited front end. He's struggling with understeer with the RB18, and I believe that's why Checo perhaps has made reference to the fact that the car is going in Max's direction, because Red Bull are probably highly focused on dealing with that situation, and that is probably hurting Checo because of the way that he works the tyres differently to Max. So that's obviously the problem that you get with different drivers and their innate driving styles. Yes, they can adapt, and yes, they are probably not too far apart from one another, but you do see that cars will trend in the direction of one particular driver from a circuit to a circuit. And as you mentioned, obviously we do have front and rear limited circuits up and down the calendar, so that he's also going to play into that factor as well.
All right, great. So let's move on, as they say, to the main course, which has to be the flexible floor. And I assume by floor, people here mean plank. Controversy that has just been dominating, maybe not even appropriately, but dominating the technical news, at least from the television commentary point of view. We have Ruland and Tame both asking for a basic explanation of what the advantages are how it was discovered, and is it just Red Bull and Ferrari?
Okay, so first up, as you mentioned, I don't call it a flexi floor because to me, as an understanding for most people, if you talk about a flexi floor, they're going to think about the carbon element of the floor. Whereas what we're actually talking about here is the plank, which is the lowest point on the bottom of the car. Now, if you flip the car upside down, which we fortunately have plenty of pictures of that now because of Zhou's crash in Silverstone and of other cars when they've been on the cranes and low loaders being recovered over the course of the last few races. If you flip that car upside down, what you will see is that there are 6 holes embedded in the floor itself. Those holes are used in order to measure both deflection and if there is any damage to the floor over the course of the race. Now, this is something that was brought in, in 94, a long time ago, in order to prevent the teams from being able to run their cars in such a way that they were basically running below the given limit. Now, basically, these holes that are in the floor, there's 3 at the front end of the plank, and they are put on the rig, and they can't. The plank can't deflect more than 2 millimeters when it's on the rig. In terms of the wear on the plank, the plank must be 9 millimeters, and it can wear no more than 1 millimeter once you've obviously gone through the race conditions. Now, what is understood is that teams are using some flexible material around the skid blocks that are in the region of these particular holes, and that allows the plank to flex more so than it would do under normal conditions. Now, what the FIA's new technical directive covers off is a percentage around the periphery of this particular hole, whereas it hasn't in the past. So what teams have been doing is they've been creating a section of the hole that doesn't typically wear this 1 millimeter or even more than the 1 millimeter. So effectively what they're doing is they're creating a section in the hole that flexes more than it should do, and effectively gaining themselves an advantage in the fact that they can come into contact with the track more so than they would be able to if they weren't using this particular type of flexi plank.
Okay, and I assume then that gives them a ride height advantage. They can run it lower with less wear.
Exactly that. So it's not only the floor that we have to consider here as well. So if you think about the previous generation of cars, we ran at a higher rake angle because that was advantageous in terms of gaining downforce. The current cars, you run pretty much flat because there's a higher degree of performance to be found in that measure. But if you also can get the front of the plank closer to the ground, you'll increase performance locally on the floor, but you will also lower the front wing, which also puts that further into ground effect. So there are benefits to be found there. So yeah, it's a big gain if you can get it. But we're talking in very small margins. So I'm not expecting the massive reset that I think people are anticipating. I think a lot of people are anticipating that it's really going to drag Ferrari and Red Bull back down the pack by over a second. But I don't think that we will see that kind of problem for them. It's going to be a marginal difference. But it will obviously have an impact on the teams.
All right, then. Sebastian Vettel has become renowned in the paddock for his support for environmental causes, and he recently spoke out on what I would consider to be, as an American, a pretty big OSHA, occupational safety and health standards, violation. It seems like the Formula One drivers have just been inhaling carbon dust from their brakes, and not just this generation of cars. The article I read referenced Bottas in 2019, and I believe even Mika Salo discovering by accident. So our listener, Bryson Sullivan, asked, regarding this problem, would it be possible to extend the duct exit backwards and dump the outflow of the air directly into the tire wake and keep this dust away from the drivers? In other words, is there, do you think, an aerodynamic solution to this mechanical problem?
Okay, so it's basically an aerodynamic solution to resolve some of the issues that we had with the previous generation of cars in the first place. So let's just rewind slightly and remember that previously teams used the brake ducts as a way as flowing airflow out through the wheel face. They used them like a bypass duct, and that helped to improve the outwash, which this set of regulations has tried to remove from existence effectively. That's why we've got wheel covers, and it's why you can no longer dump all of this airflow out through the wheel face. Now what they must do is use a sort of open scoop on the rear face of the end fence, which is more in line with the driver's face if you look at the overhead shot. Now, unfortunately, the teams will always try to gain an aerodynamic advantage, which means that they are shaping these air scoops in a way in which that is beneficial to them from an aerodynamic perspective in gaining performance. Unfortunately for the drivers, that aerodynamic performance is pushing this airflow in towards the cockpit, and with it, that comes the brake dust. So we've got a compounding problem because we've created a set of regulations to try to limit the aerodynamic impact, but we've now created a new problem. And so I think what will happen is the regulations will perhaps be looked at and tried to resolve through the change of the dimensions and position of this scoop. But in doing so, it might actually advantage the teams from an aerodynamic perspective. So it's a bit of a push and pull in terms of finding a resolution to the problem, whilst also not giving the teams another aerodynamic advantage.
Right. Well, my immediate question, although I do love aerodynamic solutions, is why could we not just simply use a simple electrostatic filter, for example, to pull the carbon out of that airstream before it bothers to exit? Do you think they might also look at something like that?
It's a possibility. I think they'll look at several solutions. I mean, the obvious solution is to go back to steel brakes, isn't it? But we know that's not happening. That I think there's things that can be done under the basis of these new regulations, but it's the unintended consequence of making changes now without doing the requisite CFD and wind tunnel work that was gone into creating this set of regulations. You know, we're making an ad hoc change to something on the fly, and that could be damaging in the short term. I think we need to look at a long-term solution rather than a short-term solution.
Well, I could not argue with that. So let's move on to the midfield. And the battle that I really want to talk about, not because one of my favorite drivers is involved, of course, but because it's the top of the midfield. It's Alpine versus McLaren. And I'm reading, I don't know if this is true, but I'm reading that McLaren is completely done development-wise for the year, except for possibly upgrading the meat puppet behind the wheel. And Alpine apparently is just getting started. Is this the Otmar effect finally coming into play for Enstone?
Well, I think that's been a bit overplayed in terms of McLaren, to be honest, because my understanding from what I've read from James Key is that they are still continuing development and they will continue development throughout the course of the season. But obviously they are also looking at the effects that they have to manage in terms of designing next year's car as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of development for McLaren. They have been a little bit slower than those around them in terms of deploying upgrades, but I think that's because they're constantly thinking about the ramifications that it might have further down the season. And of course, if they're involved in crashes and so on and so forth, then they really do have some problems in terms of being able to manage that budget. Going to Alpine, they've gone on the aggressive end of the spectrum, and we've seen a huge raft of changes made to the car over the course of the last few races. They've migrated towards a sort of dual version of the Red Bull and Ferrari side pod. They've gone even lower downforce on their rear wing. And they've made a multitude of other changes to floors, etc., to try to gain performance, and it has made a significant effect. How much further they can drag out of this car, whilst not compromising next year's car, will be very interesting. But whilst the sun is shining, as they say, make hay.
All right, then. So, in this particular battle, do you think now Alpine has the development advantage?
I think it's a seesaw effect. We're seeing them at the top end of the seesaw right now, and we could see McLaren bring something over the course of the next few races that really benefits them for the circuits that we're visiting. So I do think they're kind of almost at a level stage in terms of where they are from a car development point of view. But having said that, I'm really, really interested in the direction that Alpine have taken, because it is quite an aggressive route.
Yeah, it is. And I'm going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum now. We've seen Williams introduce a big update. Is there even a glimmer of hope for them, is what I would ask. How is the new update working? And do you think they can actually begin to get on par and score points?
Yeah, I mean, I think Williams had a very similar situation to Mercedes in that they chose a very aggressive solution that they thought would work extremely well with the new regulations, whilst maintaining some of the effects that you would have seen under the previous set of regulations. I'm talking about very narrow side pods. However, that then limits your setup window, and to go on further, it also has an impact on things like tyre wear and degradation and the performance over the course of one lap. So dialing in the car over the course of the weekend became extremely difficult, and Williams realised almost immediately that this was the wrong route and decided to travel down a different path. Having done so early on in the season. And they moved more towards what you would consider to be a Red Bull style of design with their side pods. So it's almost, I'm not saying they gave up on the original solution, it's just that they found immediately more performance in CFD and the tunnel from going down a different route. And it was, that they had to make a decision. Do you press on and try to get performance from the car like Mercedes have done, or do you go for something that's a little bit more benign in terms of setup during the course of a race weekend? And I think that's what Williams have decided to do for the remainder of this season.
Okay. So I'm going to take that as yes, there is a glimmer of hope. And I would put them, therefore, in the same bucket as Aston, who I assume are also still struggling to understand fully the changes they have made to their car.
The Red Bull car, yes.
Yes, the Red Bull car that they developed on their own. That's the one. But can we talk about maybe the most disappointing car to me on the grid, which is the Alfa Romeo? Because by all accounts, it looks really, really fast, but they have struggled so much to put together the points I think they deserve. What is happening with them? Is this a car thing? Is this a driver thing? Or is this just a Ferrari power unit reliability thing?
Again, probably a combination of factors, but more so to do with the car itself in being able to extract performance from it. It does seem a car that, again, has sort of a switch on and switch off kind of attitude to it. At one moment, it looks like it's going to blow the doors off of everything, and then the next moment it shrinks back into non-existent. So as you say, it is disappointing to see, because there are a lot of interesting developments on that particular car, but I think it's very much in the realms of what we've seen from Mercedes and Williams and have just talked about, is that it's a difficult car to try to get in the operating window, because once it's there, it then suddenly slides out of it, and then you've got to overcorrect and follow that migration throughout the course of the race weekend. And I think that's where perhaps Alfa Romeo have struggled with that car this season.
Okay, so this is actually a complaint that I think I've heard mentioned with Red Bull compared to Ferrari as well, that Ferrari is a bit more benign in its setup envelope relative to the Red Bull being sharper. We're coming up to France. Paul Ricard, what kind of a track is that? Who do you think might have the sort of concept advantage on this track? Is it more front limited, more rear limited? Where are we headed?
Well, I always think that Paul Ricard is a bit of an outlier in many ways, because there's not another track out there like it, is there really? In its nature, I personally feel that it probably will be more beneficial for Ferrari. Based on the fact that it is a high-speed circuit with tight radius corners, and we know that the Red Bull tends to suffer with more understeer. I'm not going to say chronic, but more understeer. And so, yeah, for me personally, I feel that we might see more on Ferrari, but I also think that we shouldn't really sleep on Mercedes as well, given how much their performance has increased over the course of the last few races.
Well, excellent. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us, Summers. Where can people look for you on the socials?
Well, as always, the best place is over on Twitter, and it's Summers F1.
Excellent. And I think now we're going to head back to Spanners, who has a special guest in the shed for us.
Those are some good vegetables. Hope you enjoyed that. Matt's still with me, but we are going to be speaking to a special guest in the shed, someone who knows exactly what it's like to make those difficult decisions that we all criticize from our sofa. Of course, everyone knew that you should definitely have pulled Leclerc in at that safety car. Of course, it's so obvious. Now, pass me more popcorn. But we know somebody who has been there making those decisions. Returning to the shed is Mike Caulfield joining us. Hello, Mike. Where are you joining us from in the world?
Afternoon. I'm at home in sunny Oxfordshire. Or too hot Oxfordshire, to be honest, at the moment. It's need the air conditioning of a nice trackside truck.
Yeah, well, we have air conditioning in the shed, but I can't use it while we're recording because it makes too much noise. But what are conditions like when you're in a trackside truck?
They're pretty decent. It's like it's in your car air conditioning unit basically. When you're in those trucks, they're pretty nicely climatized. I mean, a little story, if you don't mind me telling it, is obviously one 7-time world champion didn't like it too cold in the truck. Not the current one, the one who's now retired. He often had I think his conditions were that the truck had to be about 26, 27 degrees because it'd get ill because of the change of conditions of going from being really hot in the car to coming into an air conditioned truck. He thought you'd get ill, so the truck then had to cater to his needs, which meant quite uncomfortable working conditions for everyone else. But it's I guess he's the talent. So
wow. Yeah, it's interesting. If he'd have done it for comfort, but that he thought it would actually make him sick. Yeah, I would have found that frustrating as well. But for more recent drivers, they're all happy to go into some aircon ice, especially like Singapore. Yeah. It must be like such a relief to go into aircon.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore's a little bit different because obviously you don't have the trucks there. You're in the kind of purpose-built buildings, and those ones are definitely a bit more hot and humid because you'll have an office which has an air conditioning unit in it, but then you also have 20 guys with 20 laptops and 40 monitors and servers running in the room. So
very hot.
Tend to overpower the air conditioning unit in that sense. And it's not really that comfortable in the end.
So while we're talking about driver conditions, can you give us any insight to things like, Kimi, you must not have the drink and stuff like that? How much of a factor is it whether the drivers drink or not and how much water they had? Certainly we heard a couple of seasons ago, didn't Alonso go without water for the Singapore Grand Prix to save some weight?
It's not unusual for that to happen. I mean, a lot of guys, a lot of them, it is because I think the maximum generally it's about 1.5 kilos, but 1.5 kilos can make a difference in terms of the water. And I think a lot of the systems in there, I'm not going to mention names, but there was one driver in the past who wanted just to get rid of it totally.
Really?
Because obviously it's a case of it's not just the liquid water, it's all the mechanisms which allows it to pump through, and so it's actually more weight. And so he said, I never drink from it anyway. It's usually broken. It tastes like warm tea. It's crap. What's the point of having it? Take it out. And I think at the time it didn't happen just purely on that fact of, well, from a health and safety point of view, we can't in good knowledge, not like give you a drink to do it. So it's
you've got a duty of care.
I think I've never met a driver though who's actually said that they tend to drink. They don't really drink much in it, because it tastes awful. It's usually warm. It's usually it's they're concentrating, they're sweating out anyway. But more often than not, the most comments you hear about the drink package is that it's leaked and it's soaking all the fruit over them, and it's actually it's a waste of time.
Well, our normal game that me and Matt play when someone won't name a person is to just keep throwing out names and then try and look at eye movements. But we won't do that, Mike, because we've got a bunch of questions from people on Twitter. There are some really, really good ones. So thank you to everyone who responded to that and basically did my job for me. But actually, I do have a question first, because we had a conversation about Verstappen's tyre wear, and I think I wasn't clear enough. I think it might have been construed that I was saying Max Verstappen can't tyre save. That's clearly not true. He's a talented enough driver to do it. But I think it's clear that he seems to have a preference to, now give me new boots, let me push. And so I'm just wondering how much strategy is influenced by a driver's preference and abilities, especially at Red Bull, where you've got maybe different preferences on either side of the garage.
I mean, it very much depends on the type of race. So more often than not, this comes into a factor is like if it is a very borderline 2-3 stop or 1-2 stop kind of thing, where it's the situation is that okay, it's a 1 stop and the 2 stop is very close, but the 1 stop you're gonna have to manage the tires, where the 2 stop you can go flat out. Yeah. More drivers than not, I think, would preference the you gotta push flat out. I'm always happier to try and drive the car on the limit to attack and push it. But it also as well depends on the situation you're in. Sometimes there's that situation where going and doing the 1 stop and managing it, especially when more people maybe convert to a 2, might gain you those extra positions. So if you're maybe slightly out of position, it gains you that option to gain positions which you wouldn't otherwise get if you're doing the same strategy every while. So it actually very much depends on what the strategies across the field are, who you're racing against, what they're kind of doing. Because if you obviously do like for like against someone else, you're likely to stay in the same position. So to try and beat someone, you'll often go for the other aspect. So really, that's the more dominant factor rather than the driver's preference.
So do drivers ever just, come in a little bit upset because you've gone, right, we need to get him out of traffic on, say, lap 16. Now make these last till the end of the race. And it seems like the miserable option. So do drivers ever come in and go, hey, Mike?
I mean, 100%. Yeah. I mean, especially if you pull them in, they've tried to manage and then ended up being passed by 6 cars who have done the attacking 2 stop, then yeah, obviously it's not exactly the right call to do in that sense. So they will be very upset in that one. But vice versa, if you do it and you manage to hold on to the end and you've gained position against 4 cars who converted to a 2 stop,
you'll suck it up.
End of the day is the end result, which will dictate their happiness and in that respect. Or another driver who I won't name, who complained massively that we had him out on a set of 60-odd lap tyres, which blistered massively, but he got a really good result from it. But then came in and said, "Never do that to me again." So I was like, "Which one do you want? Do you want to finish? Do you want to finish in the top 5, or do you want to finish 12th?" And I could have quite happily pitted you again, but you wouldn't finish in the result you would have done. So it's
Gro Magnussen.
Oh, you got it right the first time. Yeah, okay, is it?
Fantastic. We've got a question from our listener Matthew Trumpets out here in America, I believe.
Yeah, that would be me. Thanks for having me on briefly. No, I'm curious because I know you must watch these races and you are the strategy expert here. And I'm curious, how often you find yourself second guessing calls, and most specifically, which team do you most often go, wait a minute, what were you thinking when you did that?
Yeah, don't ruin any employment chances for the future, Mike. But are you as bad an armchair strategist now that you're sitting on the sides?
I don't want to say I am. I mean, I will look at things, but I'm still lucky enough that I do have access to all the data, so I can go back and review it. But I think I've mentioned it to you before, if not other people, but I know, having been in that situation and the amount of conversations going on, we don't get all the data. We don't get that potentially there's there's a car might have a slow puncher or something, which is why they've pitted him and that way. And instead you think, well, why has he done that? Or there's an issue with some reliability issue, or maybe a bit of front wing damage, and you sometimes don't know the full story behind why teams have done it. So I try not to be too kind of judgmental in that aspect.
I see. Try like you've not succeeded completely.
No, I mean, I'll always look at things, and again, at the same time, I'll like, if I don't have the data live, I'll try not to jump at it and be up in arms straight away. But obviously, I mean, going back to obviously 2 races ago, there was one quite standout thing, which I think we'll come on to, which was having stood out at me straight away, going, it was strange.
Well, I'll tell you what then, that leads me to which listener questions I should go to next, Mike, because there is several along the lines of Ferrari. Justin's question is Ferrari. That's it. That's the question. Just Ferrari. Kevin has asked, we heard Ferrari decide on plan E for Carlos in the race. So a Ferrari like overdoing it? Is that the push to extreme? Wallace asks, what's going on at Maranello and is it salvageable? And Tom's question is, how do you become an F1 strategist? Because I can literally do better from my armchair. A little bit tongue in cheek there, I'm sure, from Tom. So lots of questions about Ferrari. I mean, do you have a take on that? And I guess from your answer, we can gauge how likely you think you are to be a Ferrari strategist in the future, I suppose.
I mean, going back on that, like, first thing about Ferrari, it's a massive team, and I think even going back to the days of the Schumacher and that, you've got basically the nation's pressure on you, because if you make a big call, like, I mean, I know it's getting there's massive criticism in this country, so I haven't even looked into what the Italian press is saying about it.
Good point.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you have, but I do know from past experiences. But obviously, you see the apologies, I forget the year wrong. Was it the 2010 when Alonso lost out in Abu Dhabi, or was that 2012?
2012, when he couldn't overtake. Petrov, yeah. Was that 2012?
Yeah.
Well, it was
that was 10. That was
2010.
10,
okay.
It? Yeah. But so obviously, and then straight after that was disastrous strategy call. And then I think, I can't remember the amount, but there's probably 3 or 4 high profile roles got heads were chopped off. So that's the kind of, I don't know if Ferrari's still going on that mentality, or they've started to change that kind of culture a little bit, because obviously that type of pressure working in is a difficult aspect. So I don't know if that pressure is still on, and strategy is a high pressured role, and you don't need the additional pressure of, I'm going to lose my job if I create this issue.
Well, I want to interrupt briefly, because obviously you worked at Mercedes, and they sort of famously had talked about a no blame culture, and you feel like maybe Ferrari, like you're describing by the press or the management, is the opposite of that. Was that true at Mercedes, that they really did have that constructive no blame environment?
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly true. It was very much a kind of culture of, right, we're not going to blame it. I mean, obviously passions run high, and then you might get initially a bit of kind of finger pointing for like unhappy people in the garage. You might say something there and everywhere, but once it comes down to the Monday, you're like, right, let's look at the data. What did we do? What can we do to make sure we don't do this again? And it was used as a learning experience. So, and there wasn't any occasions, like, I mean, you look at the structure of how Mercedes been set up, and it's basically the same trackside group, give or take, for the last 20 years. So it's one of those aspects where it is a no blame culture. It's used as a learning experience, and it's like anything in life, I think, in any job as well, is you will make mistakes. It's a sport. At the end of the day, it is a sport. You'll make mistakes. Just try not make the same mistake twice or in consecutive occasions. That's the main thing you've got to do with it. And you're always going to make some mistakes, because there's so many options and choices and unknowns that come up, and you can never be 100% certain in some of the calls you're going to make. That's the way it is, and that's what the beauty of the sport is if everything was done perfectly and manufactured and by computers, we'd have very dull races, because everyone would get it spot on, and that'd be it.
Yeah, but again, you can't go the Darth Vader route and kill one general and then go, right, take away the body, general. You can't have that kind of sinister management, Matt.
No, of course not. No, and when I go talk about Ferrari, I don't 100% know if that culture still exists. That was kind of a Ferrari of the past. What I hear is obviously with the latest with Binotto in charge, and it's they are progressing and building, and I think the strategy group there is fairly young. I mean, I think it's a quite, I'm not going to say inexperienced, because I think it's but like it's they haven't been in this championship fight properly for a long time, so they're now getting these pressure calls which they've never experienced, and they've now having to make decisions which in the past they had decisions which would have dictated fourth or fifth, whereas now they're actually losing races. And it's the same thing with the Mercedes, same thing with Red Bull. It's that it's always highlighted when you lose a race. It's never really fully highlighted if you lose fourth or fifth.
Well, I would like to follow up with a very specific example from Ferrari, from Silverstone, in fact. And that is, how much does the driver race engineer relationship complicate your strategy? Because looked at from a purely numbers point of view, you put Leclerc in front of Sainz as soon as possible. I was amazed they didn't pit him out of the way. But what really interests me was the end of the race where Sainz said, well, no, you can take your strategy and I will ignore it because I think I've got a better plan here.
Stop inventing.
So what happens when your strategy argues with you? How much more difficult does that make your job?
I mean, you try and put yourself in a position where you're never in that position. And I mean, I think even as a strategist, even if they kind of say, as soon as you put signs on brand new tires in second place behind the car, and you can't expect your driver to then not do anything with it. I mean, I think, and then this maybe comes in the experience bit where they've never been in a position where they're actually dictating these kind of situations. But unless it's fully discussed beforehand and it's kind of an agreement and kind of rules of engagement or something's been written up, I think it's a bit, I mean, again, I don't know the full conversations, I don't know the full plans, but it's a bit naive for them to have felt that Sainz was ever going to not attack him. If you're pitting on for brand new tyres, what's the point of pitting for brand new tyres? You might as well kept him in second place on the hard tyres and then held the group. So if you've pitted him onto soft tyres and then tell him not to attack it, that's just a confusing message to your driver. And your driver is quite right to say, I have no idea what you're doing there, so I'm going to do my own race.
Yeah.
Well, let me back out a bit then. We see that Sainz is perfectly willing to argue his side of the argument. It seems much more than Leclerc. When you were developing strategy, when you're thinking about how to manage this, do you take those kinds of driver race engineer relationships into account when you make suggestions to the team?
Yes and no. So, I mean, obviously these situations in the safety car is a very like on the fly, because you can never probably plan exactly what the situation is. Like, you can never go into a race knowing that, okay, I'm 2 seconds behind Leclerc with Hamilton just behind me, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these tires are this age. Before the race, you can't have that discussion. So you don't exactly know what the situation is going to be in that respect. I think the ones is the kind of plans pre-race. You'll kind of say, okay, if the car is this, we'll do this, and we might offset your strategies in that respect. I think, obviously, and again, these safety car ones, situations is there's not a time to have a conversation. So there's not a time to have discussed for the race engineer, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing. It's a case of, right, safety cars coming out. The decision, the discussion possibly should have been had before then, of saying, right, this is what we're going to do. And again, this is where I come back to my early points. Like, I don't know. We don't know how much of these discussions were had pre-safety car. If there's a safety car coming out here, we're going to keep Charles out and we're going to box Carlos. We don't know how much that was done. Did they call it as soon as the safety car come out, or had they already pre-planned that this was going to be the situation? And this is answer we don't particularly know. And this might be where there's a bit of a back and forth. But in all honesty, the race engineers during a race, they don't have the capacity to kind of argue your strategy with you anyway. Because they're concentrating so much on the car, they're concentrating on gaps, concentrating on communicating to the driver. they often don't know the whole race situation other than what you tell them.
So if you say the safety car comes down and you say we've got to pit, they'll just go, okay, pit Carlos.
Yes,
they won't. They
basically,
will just, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting.
Or it's a case of you'll say to them, for example, all right, we're in our safety car window now, like pre-safety car, and the race engineer then knows at that point, okay, I've been told I'm in my safety car window. If the safety car comes out, I'm on the radio straight away and say pit.
Good. Box, so when they say safety car window is open, they mean it would be advantageous for us to pit at this point if there's a safety car. Because obviously, correct. In years gone by, you might go a dozen races without a safety car. Now they're far more on it. Plus, they know it's entertaining as well. That's got to be in the back of their heads. So I'm assuming the strategists at nearly every point in every race are thinking, what would I do if there was a safety car now?
Yes.
I
mean, that to be fair, like that's especially in the situations with your one-stop races, or if they are one-stops. I know we are heading a bit more towards your two-stop, which is a good thing. But more on your one-stop races, once you've got that kind of first stop lap out of the way, and you've covered off your tire requirement, you've covered off any potential undercuts, etc. You just have to focus on, okay, these cars are doing an offset strategy, so we need to just do this kind of pace. But other than that, you're then just monitoring, basically lap on lap on lap. You're looking at gaps. You're looking at your tire conditions. You're basically, you're looking at, right, if there's a VSC, what do we do? If there's a safety car, what do we do? And it is, constant from that point forward. Obviously, with your two-stop races, you're more likely to be in a safety car window more often, because the tires are degrading more and you've got another stop to make anyway. So that narrows that window, widens that window for the safety car anyway. So actually, for two stops, it actually makes it a little bit easier. The ones which are always the most difficult are the ones that, like the Silverstone ones, you've completed all your stops and then it comes out 10 laps to the end. It's always the most difficult safety car call, because it's that case of, you're not going to have many racing laps after it comes in. You're always potentially chucking away positions if you don't know what other cars are going to do, because there's a bit of a spread on how the tire ages of tires or what tires other people are doing. So it's definitely the most difficult decision to make, is that end of race safety car.
At Silverstone, that felt like a no-brainer to everyone that you needed to be on the softs, and there seemed to be no downside, because if you pitted on the softs and someone else like Hamilton stayed on the hards, you're going to get him at Silverstone. Like everyone, like millions of people around the world were screaming at the TV.
Yeah, I mean, all right, if we want to discuss this, so like, I looking into it, and you've got obviously three cars. You got Charles, which had about a 5-second gap to Sainz, which had a couple of seconds gap to Lewis. The only thing I can think of, and I was trying to go through it and try and understand what I thought the Ferrari call was going to be in that sense. And like, Lewis had only stopped 5 laps earlier, so his tyres were only 5 laps old, and they had on hard tyres, which were going to go easily to the end of the race. They weren't that offset. However, and this is, so my only thought in that situation is that Ferrari thought Lewis isn't going to pit, and we don't want to put both our cars behind Lewis. However, then the thing which confuses me is they were still willing to put Carlos behind him. So they're actually removing a buffer from Charles and then putting Carlos behind Lewis anyway. So you're kind of thinking, if Lewis didn't pit. So you're then kind of questioning, why would you do that? What's the motivation of actually giving Lewis a run on Charles if they both don't pit, because Lewis tyres are newer. I mean, I think there was only 8 laps difference, but they were newer, and Lewis had generally matching the pace of the car. And it goes back into that sense of, why did they then feel it was fine for Carlos? Again, his tyres are a little bit older, so maybe they thought they wouldn't restart. But that was the issue with the hard tyres. I think with Mercedes, obviously they had a totally free pit stop. So again, that's another thing Ferrari should have looked at. But Mercedes had a totally free pit stop, so they had no harm in not pitting, because if they'd not pitted and Ferrari had pitted both their cars, they knew there would have been a sitting duck. So and that was it. And it was a really strange one in that sense.
Matt.
Yeah, I had just wanted to briefly ask, because that was such a high profile call, and obviously the person who made it, although not named and shamed in the media, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's got to be really just brutal when you're a strategist and something like that happens. Has there ever been a call, and this is a listener question or Bird Pink, has there ever been a call like that you made that to this day, you wake up in the middle of the night going, oh, why did I do that?
It was Bird Pinkerton. We have to say that. Very good American journalist. Friend of the show, we hope.
Yeah, 100%. And it's, the nemesis of Monaco. So that was with Kevin in 2019. Yeah. So we were obviously really good qualifying, running, I think it was fifth in qualifying. And we were in the race and we were stuck behind Daniel Ricciardo in that first stint. And Ricciardo was managing, as in, I think the safety car came out on lap 9 or 10 or something. And by that point, the top 4 cars had already got 20 seconds down the road and we were stuck behind Daniel Ricciardo. And obviously with Monaco, track position's key. So you kind of think, okay, right, if we don't pit and everyone else pits, we're going to struggle here. However, so we made the call to pit Kevin on that one. Daniel Ricciardo pitted at the same time when we came out behind him anyway. So we didn't gain a position there. But the worst thing is we obviously lost position. Basically, no one behind us, directly behind us, didn't stop. And we also came out behind some cars which had started on that. So I think we'd started on the soft tire on that one, and we came out behind some cars which were on the medium. So we knew obviously they were already going long. So again, that was the first mistake I made. Should have looked at where we're going to come out, and we were going to come out behind cars who were going to go along on that first stint, which was a mistake. Because obviously
slower cars presumably as well down the grid.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, slower cars on a track which you can't overtake regardless. So that was a mistake. And then the next thing that played into it was that Lando then played the ultimate teammate card and drove slowly and held up a gap to allow, I think it must have been Carlos at the time. To pull out and get a free pit stop, which then basically, where we'd fallen out in this meant we got caught behind this, but we allowed some cars to pull out in front, and then and I think we ended up finishing 14th. And I'm really like, me and Kevin get on really well. It's like we still get on really well, still talk quite a lot. But yeah, he came up to me after, and I felt I was awful. I was gutted. I was gutted at the time. I knew it was wrong, and Kevin, fair play to him, came up afterwards and went, "That was a strategy, wasn't it?" And it was, and it still haunts me to this day. So that's the worst one, because I think we finished 14th, which with a car which was very much capable of finishing on merit 5th, and I can't remember exactly what happened, but there was a potential even a couple of cars dropped out, which meant there would have been a chance of a podium for that one, which would have been a fantastic result.
I don't want to make it even worse, but like obviously the position the team was in then, like that would have changed the whole mood of the team and the camp of like that evening, from like disappointment to like a full on celebration. And then you're sitting there just going,
and the thing about it as well is, the worst thing as the strategist is that everyone knows it's your call. And you're like, there's nothing more you can do and say, I've messed up there. It's
hands up.
It's like and you feel awful because you have let down. You've let down the driver. It's not just the driver. You've got guys who have worked on the car for 4 days straight, and they're putting hours, and a chance of getting good points, if not a podium, and you've let them down, and it's an awful feeling. So I have full sympathy for the Ferrari guy, because you never do anything deliberately. You never think he obviously had a reason for doing, or the team had a reason for doing what they're doing. And then, I mean, granted, the team still won the race regardless, so it balances out a little bit, but you will have one unhappy side of the garage / driver. And the worst thing is as well is that this is a good thing about me and Kevin, is like, he never lost trust in me just because of that one mistake. I explained it all to him. I explained what the decisions was, and we moved on. But you don't want to ever be in that position where you lose the trust of the driver either, because if that happens, then you are in trouble.
I'm so glad you've shared that, and thank you for sharing that, because I could see the pain etched on your face as you were talking about it. But we know when the driver's been it, like Lewis Hamilton has felt really bad in the qualifying. He's like, so sorry to everyone who's put effort in. Thanks for fixing the car. But, for example, I think it was at Haas as well when Grosjean's tyre didn't go on from a very good position in the season opener in 20-something.
Australia 2018.
Oh, well, you were there? Were you there?
Yep.
Oh, you were there. And then the pictures of Roman Grosjean going and like hugging the pit guy and how devastated he must be. Like, we don't really think enough about how when it goes wrong and not a driver's side, the emotions that go on in the team.
Yeah, it swings and roundabouts, and it's like, it's always the case of, I mean, again, put it on the counter point of view. It's like I can't remember what race it was, but I'm not going to go into too much specifics because I don't want to vamp. But like, you have two drivers who are kind of potentially going to take each other out, and they take each other out, and then in the race, and you sat there and you're going, I've worked 18 hours days for the last 4 days, and you've just taken each other out on lap one.
Yeah.
So like, and at that point, you don't know. Like, obviously they feel bad, but then they're more angry. They're like, I'm not sure if they have the same kind of remorse for someone like myself would do. I don't know. Maybe they would.
There's not enough tapas in Barcelona to quash those emotions, is there? To make you feel better. Final question, Mike. We really do appreciate your time. This has actually just come fresh in on Twitter. Tom Graham says, Mike, how many times was your strategic advice ignored, only then for you to be proved correct? And I think there was a good question here from, I can't remember who it's from, but if a driver just decides to take the strategy into his own hands by either not pitting or just coming in and pitting.
I mean...
Oh, that's Blen Orangey. Thank you for that question.
Luckily enough, I think most drivers are knowledgeable enough not to do that.
Okay.
So like, because if they just came in, you're going to end up in an empty box and you're going to lose a lot of time and it's going to be a disaster for you. I mean, the ones you can maybe look at is you're calling for someone to pit and they're like going, no, I'm staying out. But again, you need to kind of, they don't have all the information, and I think enough drivers know that they don't have the full race picture. They can maybe something seems a bit strange to them, but hopefully they have the understanding and trust that what are you doing? What you're doing is correct in terms of why I'm calling you in. And even though it seems a bit strange to them, you often hear Lewis at times going, "These tyres are really good. I want to go along," etc. And the team's like, "Yeah, we understand that, but we've got all the numbers, we're doing all the simulations, we're looking at the gaps closing. If we leave you much longer, you're going to have to go through 4 cars of traffic. So even if you're offset at the end of the race, you're potentially going to use up that tyre offset trying to overtake these cars."
Well, Austria was a good example, wasn't it? Because looking at the timing screens, he did look to be on pace, and you think, oh, may as well just leave him out. Just leave him out forever. He's looking like he's on pace. But I suppose the strategists are seeing maybe a potential tyre drop off and then looking at gaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's it. So they're looking at lap times, and also it's a case of what he might be looking at consistent lap times, but actually what you're seeing, and what I think Austria showed was that because I think it rained heavily overnight Saturday to Sunday, but the track was actually quite green at the start of the race. So while the degradation wasn't high so much, every time someone went onto a new set of tyres, there was a significant lap time improvement. So actually the degradation was fairly high in the tyres. It was kind of masked by the track improving. So Lewis is sat around going, my lap times are remaining consistent, but actually it's the track improving. Whereas then someone sticks a brand new set of tyres on, they're then going 1.5 seconds quicker.
And that's the thing, the driver would not necessarily feel that difference because the grip level stays the same.
Because it's balancing out. He's feeling the track grip increase, which he thinks the tyres are still good. Whereas the tyres are actually dropping off, and you only actually see it when new people put on new tyres and actually go, oh, look how much quicker they are now they've got their new sets on. Okay, so actually the track evolution has balanced out your tyre degradation there.
Oh, a quick one.
And that's the kind of comments where a driver might go, the tyres feel good. And he's like, yes, but they're not as good as a brand new set.
Finally, just to pick at that thread, when you talk about track evolution, we see it so much in qualifying and especially in changeable conditions where you're getting a drying line. How hard is it to track evolution? And is that your job as the strategist?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's not an exact science because, I mean, track evolution actually lumps in a lot of things in my kind of experience. But obviously, the track as rubber goes down, it naturally increases the grip. But you also got to kind of balance off the tire going off to how lap time's going. So it's that kind of degradation / track improvement. But then we try and map it throughout the whole weekend. But at the same time, say P1 example, and you say, the track's getting a lot better. Well, actually, what you find is the drivers go out to do the first laps. They're nowhere near the limit. They'll be like, knowing it's P1, I'm going to get my use right. I'll see what the track's like and I'll gradually build up to it. So you actually see what people are calling track improving. It's not, it's just the drivers gradually like building it up to it. And the same in qualifying to a certain extent as well. But you'll find you'll have your top guys like your Verstappens and Leclerc. They're not going to go flat out in Q1 because by the end of Q3, they will be on that final lap. They're fully on the limit, but they can't. They know they've got the car to get through to Q3 easily, so they're not going to risk spinning off or crashing the car in Q1. So they'll just rein it back a little bit. So that's where you also see that kind of improvements throughout.
Can you tell? Can you tell if a driver's just 95%?
Not really. No. I mean, it's difficult for the trained eye, but you kind of know that they're not. You know the guys who are kind of, if you watch the onboards, if they're kind of properly fighting the car, that's when they're on the limit. Right. So, but it's if they look fairly steady and they're just kind of building up to it, and that's also sometimes where you see the top teams in Q1. I mean, always in quali one is that your fastest approach will be 1 time lap, maybe 2 times lap, so fast, and you'll see some of the big teams go out and do like a 5, 6, 7 lap run, and that's again because they're not driving at full day and they're gradually just eking it out and the match it. So that's an indication, but they're not driving to the limit, because if they're driving to the limit, the tires would be finished after that first lap, and you wouldn't be able to keep on improving your lap times throughout the session.
So from this conversation, I'm gleaning there's probably more to being an F1 strategist than we can quite comprehend from our sofas, but it's not going to stop us trying to be the best armchair strategists we can. But hopefully you speaking to us, and if you'll speak to us more often, will help us be the best armchair strategists we possibly can.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating thing, and I enjoy talking about it, and I enjoy like letting people know about the ins and outs of it. So yeah, definitely.
Go and follow Mike Caulfield, F1 on Twitter. Some interesting stuff from you on there. I'll spell your name because you spell it funny. You spell it wrong. Caul Field. Cau Field. So Mike Caulfield, F1. Thank you for your time and thanks for joining us. And tell us where to get your secret data sources from at some time, won't you?
Yeah, maybe.
Sounds like a no. Cheers, Mike.
Cheers. Thank you.
An amazing insight to F1 strategy, and very, very generous of him to share a failure. It's often much easier to talk about your victories, and although it might be fun for other people, it can be quite traumatic to live through those times where I should have done better. But that's how we learn, eh? And don't worry, I make plenty of mistakes on this podcast, so I definitely know about learning from mistakes. But someone who I learn about racing from is Mr. Bradley Philpot, who joins me on the stream in the shed now. Hey, Brad.
Good afternoon, Spanners.
Tell me about your Through the Visor thing. Our patrons will have heard your latest content creation, but it's been going fantastically well, and I'm jealous. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so a little while ago, I decided to try and make my own content about the driving side of Formula One, because obviously whenever I appear on Miss Apex, you can't just blab about the specific topic you want to talk about for half an hour or 15 minutes at a time. So
Matt does. He doesn't care.
That is true. I thought I'd make my own little series where I could go into a bit more detail. And the way we've formatted it is essentially after every Grand Prix, I take some questions from Twitter and then answer the ones that I feel I can do the most justice. The things people ask me all sorts of questions about the technical side, which obviously isn't really my expertise. So I try and answer the ones that directly relate to the driver's experience, what the driver's going through, and why they may have chosen to do a certain thing, and what it's like from the cockpit. No,
I love that, because it's exploring kind of a core element of our sport, the rules, how they're adhered to, and it's strange that it's not something that's actually dug into by a lot of content creators, which is why we have the Whose Fault Is It segment, where instead of going, oh, it's a racing incident, we really kind of borrow down into what is it under the letter of the law, what is it under the spirit of racing. And as a fairly experienced racing driver yourself, when you're in a series, how aware are you of the very specific rules of that series when you get to a wheel-to-wheel bit of action?
So generally, you don't need to be, because generally the rules are they're kind of understood. There's unsaid and unwritten driver conduct rules that you just get used to. And then around the fringes of those things, if we're talking about racing battles and what you're allowed to do in different situations, around the edges, in the more extreme cases, then yes, you could probably get into more detail about who was technically at fault for an incident. But in my own driving experience, you just never have an incident. You cannot afford to have an incident. So in my entire race career, I can't think of a single time outside of karting where I've actually made contact with another car and hadn't had an accident. You just can't do that.
Okay, well, sorry to do this to you, but I can think of a time. Weren't you in a multi-class series and you ended up having a Porsche chop over the side of you and you went off track on the inside and ended up hitting the Porsche?
Yeah, so even that example, so that's the one thing that we can point to. That was on an outlap in practice. So that's like leaving the pits in a practice session. So that wasn't a racing incident. I wasn't racing against that car. That's purely a misunderstanding with that car not realizing I was exiting the pits. And I think I've spoken about this before, but also my team fitting tires, which they hadn't told me, that hadn't been warmed up, and basically sending me out on cold, hard tires without letting me know that. As far as I was concerned, I was still on the hot, warmed up tires that I'd just come into the pits on and thought I had a lot more grip. Yeah, even that situation, that's a real rarity. So what we see in Formula One, where there's lots of incidents for us to dig into and lots of things for us to try and pin down to whether or not someone did something against the rules or which driver was at fault in a battle where it went wrong. It's not as common to have these kind of incidents in other series where people are having to pay for their own accident damage or find the money from someone else.
Yeah, I'm almost like I feel bad because I know what a talented racer you are. I feel bad that you've kind of had to drive in a way where you've really had to protect your car, because I guess like you have to put money up, don't you, in a lot of those series? And if you have an accident, you lose that money.
Yeah, essentially I never really had the money to put down on the deposits. The teams like you to put down a damage deposit, which you then get back at the end. But my sponsorship tended to stretch just about to the drive itself, and we worry about the accident damage later. And unfortunately, I even had my friend put down a credit card deposit on his own credit card at one point, 15,000 euros, so I could race in a 6-hour race in a Porsche Cayman at the Nürburgring. And it wasn't until I got back in the pits, finished my stint, and got out of the car that I could finally relax, because at any moment up until then, even if it's out of your hands, if the car fails and you go in the barrier, you're still responsible for the accident damage, unless you can prove beyond any doubt that it was definitely just a failure. So
if you're going to have any series and racetrack where you, if any crash you have costs your friend money they don't have, but they've put a credit down for, I mean, the Nordschleife seems like a really sensible track to do that on. And
funnily enough, though, actually, the drivers tend to be quite respectful because people know that. But I've been in plenty of situations against GT3 cars who are quite often factory back drivers who are not paying for their own damage and are in effectively a 4 or 6 hour sprint race as far as they're concerned, who don't treat you as nicely. And then it basically falls on to you to give them even more room and make sure you definitely are being very predictable when you're allowing them to lap you and that kind of thing.
How far down does this issue go? And is it also an issue on the ladder to Formula One? Do you think there's some drivers who can just drive with abandon and others who are like, oh, this is my only ticket to the chocolate factory competition?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes all the way down to karting. If you can't afford £150 or £200 for a new set of nose cone and side pods in a car, I mean, in full-on racing karts, the pods are a lot more fragile than what you or I are more used to
on a rental,
recent times in a rental kart, where you can knock into someone and carry on, and then the karts crash into each other all day long. In a full-on racing kart, you bump into someone significantly and you're buying new pods and new stickers, and a whole new set could be hundreds and hundreds of pounds, which isn't a lot in the grand scheme of the rest of your racing career if you carry on into single-seaters, but it's still lots of money. And that, a lot of drivers, the majority probably, are having to drive with that in mind. And this is why these these whose fault is it situations that you cover on Missed Apex and the kind of things I'm covering on my YouTube series, they are, for a lot of drivers, not an option. That you cannot stay up someone's inside as they're turning towards you because you can't afford to fix it. And again, you can't turn in on someone hoping they move out of the way, because if they don't, that's your season over.
That must be a real psychological advantage when you get to, like, you know, junior high level karting. That must really affect some battles.
Yeah, I mean, and this is why it's difficult to look upon the billionaire contingent that make it to the top level of motorsport and fully respect their journey as much as you would someone who didn't have that. Yeah, I mean, and it's not just that. You can go into the amount of opportunity they have outside in terms of the number of races they can enter and the amount of practice they get, but just in pure terms of the caution that they need to take into racing situations, it's completely different. It's not equal. Just because you're in the same series, probably in the same kind of car as everyone else, it doesn't mean your mindset can be the same as someone who can afford the damage.
So in previous seasons, that might have also been the case in F1 between teams with different budgets, but with the cost cap, I guess, like, even the top teams will really feel it now when you start getting accident damage.
Yeah, and I think even just this weekend at Austria, we saw in the sprint race Hamilton driving with quite a lot of caution. You covered it on the podcast last week, and I was criticising Hamilton as well for not being aggressive enough in the sprint race. I'd still stand by that and say that the moves that I was advocating him going for were very low risk. It wasn't like I was thinking, oh, why isn't he just sending it recklessly up the inside? I was still thinking there's a pretty easy, controlled outbraking move on here. But anyway, regardless, they've said publicly, Mercedes, that if they had much more damage, they had the real prospect of not being able to race the following day. So yeah, it is something that the teams need to pay attention to now.
That was a nice little diversion. I'm always interested in what it's like for non-funded drivers. We could one day we'll come back. We'll do a deep dive in your attempt to do the impossible, which is try to be a racing driver with, like, normal people's money, which in the end is, you know, probably like just slamming your head into a brick wall for 35 years.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, okay. But I wanted to ask you what might seem like a dumb question, but we'll see what we get out of it. So obviously you've driven everything from single-seaters to GT sports cars, done a lot of karting, and done a lot of sim racing. I've done less racing than that, Brad. It might surprise you to learn. But I am getting into my karting now because we do a lot of Missed Apex events, and it's always with rental karts. Relatively low power, but we do kind of enter into this competition spirit throughout the day. And my wife called it race car karaoke. So we all get to kind of pretend to be race drivers for the afternoon. And then, of course, we do a lot of sim racing as well. We have relatively good rigs at home. So my stupid question to you is it harder to drive a race car than a go-kart?
So we need to just clarify we're talking about like the accessible everyday carts that anyone can pay and go and drive.
What I'm experiencing at Missed Apex events.
Yeah, and also probably need to clarify what we mean by race car, because race car could range from everything from the kind of car you sampled at Silverstone with Alex Van Gien, which was it a Peugeot 206 car?
Yeah.
In like a club level, I'm sure no one will mind me saying, like the kind of entry level.
Yeah. No.
Level front wheel drive.
You're not
race
insulting
car.
them, yeah.
And that is a race car. And I was actually out at Silverstone yesterday in something very similar. Doing some coaching, like a Golf GTI. Or race car could stretch all the way up to, you know, high powered single seater or GT3 car style thing. And there is a really big difference, and that's why I try and make this distinction.
Okay.
So the things, maybe let's look at what's similar. First of all, sim racing that you and the Missed Apex crew do, and rental kart / Missed Apex race events are a really, really good window into what the racing side of driving a race car is like. So in terms of positioning, the heat of battle, apart from the damage not being a worry, if we rule that out, the actual physics and mechanics of the racing side, and the sporting side and the racecraft, that's actually really pretty close. Where it starts to get further and further diverge from what I've experienced in race cars is the brutality of all the forces that are happening to you. It's very easy and I'm guilty of this as well, it's very easy when you do a significant amount of rental karting and sim racing to forget just how loud, brutal, hot, scary a fast race car is.
Right.
And that's probably the biggest difference. When you go out when I was doing some sim racing and then at the weekend going off to race at the Nürburgring, the thing that would always hit me immediately, and you get used to it, you become accustomed to it, especially the more experienced you are, but it's just how it's so important for you to not get anything wrong, because you've suddenly got the risk of physical injury, financial penalty, the weekend being over. If on iRacing or at a rental car race, we make a mistake, we still get to carry on. You make a mistake, even if you were to make a massive mistake and have a crash into a wall, which is something which would be major in a race car.
A marshal can pull you out.
A marshal can pull you out, or you can hit reset and start again. Obviously, bearing in mind that in an iRacing race, you can't just crash. But there's nothing stopping you from just carrying on and doing another one. But in a race car, there really is. So you have to be very mindful of that. And everything, there's much more of an assault on your senses. And I'd say G-forces, the faster the car is, obviously, the more grip you've got, the more physicality starts to become a limiting factor. So just as a couple of examples, when I was testing F3 cars, I would, despite being an instructor at the time and always being out in race cars and being pretty reasonably fit and having quite a strong neck, I was getting to the point where I couldn't manage more than maybe 10 laps at a time.
Oh, really?
Having to come in because my neck just could not handle it. And this is a Formula 3 car from a few years ago, nowhere near a Formula 2 or Formula 1 car of modern times. So that's from someone who's pretty race fit anyway.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't feel that at all in a rental car.
So you would have to go and do specific training to do like a series in F3.
Yeah. Or do more of the F3 racing or testing or whatever, and naturally build up that strength. And even in karting, last year I've mentioned this a couple of times, my sponsor M4M was really nice. In that although they couldn't afford to pay for me to do any major car racing last year, they paid for me to do some very expensive karting. And I'd never experienced such crazy forces on my body, to the point where, as you know, I broke my ribs twice just from the G-force, despite wearing an expensive rib protector. And again, that was just as brutal, if not more brutal, than the Formula 3 testing. And that's a kart. So it shows you kind of the difference between what we generally get to race, the more accessible, doesn't cost you $5,000 a weekend kind of karting, and then the kind of level that the drivers on the Formula 1 ladder are going through.
Oh, I see. So on the rental carts, okay. So for me, I'm reasonably fit. I have upper body strength, but it's a good pump for me on those rental carts. And by the end of the afternoon, after 4 races, I'm like, phew, yeah. If someone said you can do that again for free tomorrow, I'd probably go, maybe I'll leave it a couple of weeks. Do you think that if I was to go up to the sort of rental carts, the sort of carts you had paid or been paid to go and race, would I find that a big shock? Because even on our rental carts, there are some people who will drop out after 3 races and go, do you know what? I've had a nice day. I'm going to save my body.
Put it this way. This will be something very... this isn't something you will have experienced in a rental car, I imagine. I was getting to the point where I would go out and after 3 or 4 laps, I could not keep my head upright. And I'm talking acceleration out of the corners. My head was trying to fall backwards off my neck and laterally. And I was having to cut my practice sessions short because I just couldn't. You're losing 2 or 3 seconds a lap because you can't look where you're going. That's the kind of brutality. So yeah, I would actually, and I know you're quite a fit guy, I don't reckon you'd last 1 race without having to go 5-10 seconds slower than you wanted to go.
Just to preserve,
physically that hard.
So
and that's why there's a massive advantage to having the opportunity to do it more often and do a lot of testing just to physically prepare yourself for it.
So I think we can appreciate that in an F1, when they parachute in someone like Paul di Resta or Nico Hülkenberg, unless they've been just keeping up their full F1 training, and why would you if you're a pundit mostly, it's actually a much harder ask than we perhaps realise. And Magnussen coming back saying, I'm not quite strong enough for these cars.
Yeah, and I think Magnussen even specifically mentioned his neck being a bit of a problem at the first race he was back, because there really is no substitute to being race fit. And this is a guy that's been racing prototypes and IndyCar and all sorts of other stuff, which also require you to have extremely good neck muscles.
So, well, this is a big ask, but let's forgive me the fitness. Okay, let's say that I can get up to the fitness to drive a race car. So, like maybe something like a GT3 or what you were a class champion of at the Nordschleife, which was a Peugeot factory car.
It's a TCR car, yeah. So like a touring car, or like BTCC would be analogous.
Oh, okay. So let's say we put me into there, but we give me the physicality. I finally, I lose that £10, and I get a little stronger. And we can take away the financial side of it. But I'm in a race. Okay, so having experienced a bit of a race competition experience at karting level, and actually, I was reasonably on pace in this last one. I was able to race the likes of Kyle and yourself and kind of see you on the same bit of track. How would I adapt? What would shock me about entering that kind of field for a competitive race?
I think it would shock you how fast people were initially, because there would be, because you don't have a lot of experience, probably basically no experience in a race car competition. No matter how good your potential is, no matter how good you could be given more practice, everyone you're up against has done a lot more practice and will be way less afraid of the car than you. And I don't mean, when I say afraid, I mean they'll be more confident to lean on it and know where they can get away with leaning on it. And you would find it initially a big shock just how far off the pace you were, saying nothing about your actual skill. You just need to become acclimatized to the speed and how fast a real race car is.
And as a proper driver, have you found that dropping into a series or a field of drivers and gone, oh, poof, that's going to take some catching up?
When I did my first BTCC test at Donington, I was the data I was being compared to was Jason Plato, because he was the regular driver in the car I was in, and I thought I was braking really late. I thought I was pretty much on the limit of what I could get away with, and despite the data was from a different day, different conditions, different tires, whatever, any excuse you can come up with, but the fact was, there was clearly more margin in the braking areas than I was giving the car credit. 10 meters or so to begin with. So that's me, and I'm going in. I would have jumped into that a much higher starting point than a normal person who hasn't had years of experience driving similar cars.
You can say a higher starting point than the likes of us mugs. That's fine.
And it's not even just that. It's not even just the driving the car as well as it can be driven. The more experienced you are and the more you've done in the past, the more you just know how you want things like your seat position and how far away from the buttons you are and all that kind of thing. You just get in and you make sure that's all right. First of all, you don't waste your time.
Ergonomics.
Yeah, exactly. All the ergonomics of being in a race car, you just get it right first time. You're very clear in what you're asking your mechanic to do to get the pedals exactly where your feet need them to be. Things like that. I'm very particular on my sim about these things as well. But I think the main thing you would experience, this is why I'm desperate to get you in a race car, Spanners. I know I've mentioned a few times trying to get you around the Nordschleife in anything. And I mean, even a road car, I think would have a similar effect on you, a quick enough road car, some kind of hot hatch. I want you to feel what it's like to be in a car, not a rental car or the Peugeot 206 you drove, because I think it was wet when you drove that as well.
It was wet. So yes, we didn't, there was no grip.
Yeah, so apex speeds and end of straight speeds and stuff are just much, much lower. I really want you to feel and experience the brutality of it. We've got to at some point get you out, whether it's going to Palmer Sport or something like that. We need to get you out on track.
Oh, Brad, I'm an old man. I'm 41, and I just don't feel that urge to take those kind of risks. And I do feel that fear. That's why ultimately I would never be a race car driver, because even like the first few laps out in a rental car, I have a little moment of blimey, these are a bit quick. Oh, blimey, you have to go quite close to that barrier. So I'm not sure I'm your prime candidate for that. But yeah, I think the average person just has no idea of that sensation. So whilst I see the spirit of what you're talking about, I don't really want to.
I'm keen for you to, at the very least, experience it as a passenger, even in like a low risk scenario.
Okay.
Mainly because of the kind of noises and the kind of sensations that you don't realize the drivers are going through when you're watching on TV. There's certain sounds and certain G-forces in certain directions and sensations that the car gives you that you just don't experience unless you've actually experienced it. The TV can't really get it across to you.
Maybe somewhere with a lot of runoff, Brad.
Well, Silverstone, for example, I was at Silverstone yesterday, and as I said, we were in kind of track-prepared Golf GTIs on semi-slick tires. So we're not talking about anything particularly exotic, and we're talking about a really big, wide F1 track. And I was actually it's been a while since I've been out on Silverstone, and I was impressed with how good they felt. So it doesn't even need to be anything particularly amazing. Those pretty standard cars felt like they were quite at home going around Silverstone, and it gave a good impression of what a lowish level race car would feel like. And you've got lots of margin at Silverstone. So we've got to work out a track there at some point. And I'd advise, as you do, to all the listeners, I'd advise anyone who has the opportunity to turn a wheel, even if it is rental car or sim racing, do it, because it gives you definitely a big part of the kind of insight into what being a driver's like. There's just some elements that you can't replicate.
I'm really heartened by the fact that you say the competition element of it, and that wheel to wheel is, you're getting some benefit out of that and experiencing some of that. Because when we talk about like defending, something you've worked on me with my racecraft is positioning, and how, for example, on a left-right corner, you don't have to immediately go back to the racing line if you don't want to. If you've got a car that was on your outside for the first corner, you can just hold your line and make it really difficult for them to go into the next corner. And it's just like little things like positioning. Now that I understand that, I watch F1 through different eyes, and I look at their positioning, and I can be a bit more judgmental and a bit more of an armchair coach.
Yeah, so it's exactly that. Yeah. The way that transfers through the different categories is pretty clear. The way to defend and the way to attack is pretty similar across the board. So I actually wonder how people who have never done that kind of thing, never even maybe played a race game that's moderately realistic, I wonder what they're seeing, because it must be a very different viewing experience. For example, seeing Verstappen defend against Leclerc at turn 3 last weekend, and watching it as people who are a bit more experienced, you can see where his car is going to end up on the exit. It's almost like you've got some kind of predictive vision. You can see slightly into the future, because based on the speed he's going and the line he's taking now, he's going to naturally end up on this other trajectory on the exit, and the car that's attacking him is going to end up on wherever. You can kind of see what's about to happen. And people who haven't had that experience, haven't done a cut back on a go-kart on a indoor track or whatever, wouldn't necessarily have that same experience.
So definitely, like, I've only started doing this kind of stuff since meeting you guys. So really only in the last few years have we taken the karting a little bit more seriously, and then of course the sim racing. And to me, I get that same competition feeling from sim racing as I do from karting. I know people like to kind of poo-poo it, but it's definitely changed how I look at stuff, even down to when you've got a car dive bombing down the inside of even like a hairpin, and when you're the car doing the dive bomb, that decision of like, will I make it, will I not? And when you're the outside car defending, is the, do I go for the apex, or do I have to account for a car that's about to suddenly appear here? Those kind of basic dynamics from a game or from karting, it really changes your view on watching it on telly.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you're at that point now. And actually, without wanting to blow too much smoke, you're at a much higher level than you were when I first
Hooray.
met. Even though you probably would have judged yourself to be a half decent rental carter back in the day.
Yeah, stag do hero. I was a stag do hero. Like, so I would win all stag do's and kart things, and then when I started racing with you guys, I suddenly realised, oh no, I'm miles off.
So really, the one thing you are missing, as we've touched upon before, the thing that you're missing when you, in terms of your viewing experience, that I'm kind of imbuing my watching of the race with, I'm kind of subconsciously always aware of this, is the brutality, the noises, the smells, the heat, the danger side of things that you haven't had that actual experience of.
No.
You've had the jeopardy in the sim racing. It's very easy to damage the vehicle. So it's not like you've only ever driven a rental car, and if you turn in on someone, you don't have this awareness of the impact of the damage, but it's all the reality of it, like the realness of something could actually hit me in the head. I could actually break my arm if I hit the barrier at the wrong angle here, and you're just acutely aware of that.
So what if I take my experiences of being deployed in helicopters, where I was convinced that every single noise was about to kill me, and that there's no physical way that this thing could physically fly, because it's clearly impossible and witchcraft. If I take that feeling and apply it to my racing incidents, will I get more of an idea of what's going on?
That's actually probably pretty closely analogous. The being inside a military helicopter with all the noises,
it's awful.
There's some real similarities there to being in a single seater, where
I bet.
Like the sounds just seem to kind of resonate around you, and it
You
could be
feel
something which
sounds.
is entirely
Yeah.
exactly something could be completely innocuous, but it also could be a tire about to fail. It could be something that's your brakes are maybe working loose. There's so many things that could be wrong, and I guess you learn to tune them out the longer that you're the more driving you've done. Just to give an example, at the Nürburgring, if anything goes wrong with your car at the Nürburgring, if you're in anything that's remotely fast, you're almost certainly going into the barriers, because by the time you've managed to even collect the car up, you're already at the edge of the track, and it's very narrow and there's a wall right there. And I would quite often hear, because there's no sound deadening in a race car, it's not even that it's been stripped out, it never even had an interior when it rolled out of the factory. You hear stones and pieces of rubber on the bottom of the car, and they sound very, very loud, especially if you've got an intercom in. I've got kind of earplugs, but also a microphone. So certain sounds are amplified through your headphones. And I would hear pieces of gravel and rubber hit the bottom of the car, and you learn to tune that out. But one time I heard this, and it wasn't going away. And then suddenly I had a giant moment of oversteer, nearly went in the barrier, but managed to avoid it and continue. And the noise immediately stopped. And what it turned out it was actually lots of pieces of rubber had become lodged in the wheel arch. And it was this lump of rubber, like a kind of handful, beginning to kind of catch on one of the rear tires and eventually drop out of the wheel arch, stick to the tire briefly for one or two rotations, and effectively like running over a kind of giant
you get like
marble.
a moment of lock almost.
Just a sudden moment where one of the rear tires is off the floor momentarily. So you kind of gone over an artificial bump, and then it was gone. But I would have never been able to tell you what that noise was until that happened, because it had never happened to me before. But I'm sure I'd recognize the signs next time. There's not a lot you can do about it, because it might never fall down. You can't just drive around slowly until it happens. But
so interesting when you hear Verstappen talking of when he had the bit of the AlphaTauri, stuck in his floor, and he's sitting there kind of trying to describe to everybody what's happening.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this in one of my recent videos, that it will have felt probably like a puncture to him initially, because essentially what he's feeling is a lack of grip on one of the corners of the car. One area of the car is not responding like normal. And initially, say you're getting a load of oversteer all of a sudden, that could well be a puncture. Most of the time, that sensation is probably a puncture. And then he'll have been working out, okay, well, there's not as much body roll as I'd expect if it was really a puncture. The car would be just rolling on its axis a little bit more.
And it's not getting
trying
worse
to deduce what it is. But no obvious visible damage apart from that. So obviously, as you become more experienced, he couldn't have known that. That was a very specific problem. But once you've been in a race car a long time, you probably get to the bottom of it quicker and work out, is this something I can just carry on with or not?
And you address this in your YouTube video. You say, where can I find such a fascinating piece of, not that you need our help, your views are insane at the moment, but where can we send our listeners and viewers to go and watch your videos?
So if you just search for Brad Philpot on YouTube, or Through the Visor is the name of the series, that particular video will have been called British Grand Prix, Your Questions Answered Through the Visor. But there's a series, they're doing reasonably well. That particular video, the British Grand Prix one, for whatever reason, got a lot of views. The subsequent ones have still done pretty well, but not quite the same heady heights as that one.
That's how it goes with videos, though. Keep people come and find it, and the odd amount stay and subscribe, which you seem to have done well. But I've got one last question before you go, Brad. I'm going to give you 2 mythical seasons of funding, and also I'm going to give you 5 years back in age. No offense. Which series now?
I'm going to need some more than that.
Let's give you 10 years. Where does that put you? In your mid 20s, late 20s?
Yeah. So 26.
We'll give you that. So I'm going to give you 2 seasons to kickstart your career. Where are you going?
Yeah, so at 26, I'd already be way, way too old for single-seaters. So we'll rule out anything single-seater-ish. 26 is probably an excellent age to begin your top-level GT3 career. So, I mean, a lot of the drivers are younger than that, but that's where I would be. That's where I'd be going. I'd be looking at some, maybe a season of British GT with a good team, and then move on to a season of VLN in GT3, or NLS as it's now called, the Nürburgring's Endurance Championship.
So in a GT3, and from there, because I'm only giving you 2 seasons, I'm only granting you 2 seasons, is there opportunities for like a good driver? Let's say you deliver, like you have done in the past, you win your class. Is there those opportunities that exist that someone might go, that guy's brilliant, we should get him in our car?
Yes, and just to give an example of that, there are opportunities. My friend and former adversary is a driver called David Pittard, and we both got through to the final of the Peugeot search for a factory driver from the UK back in 2013. I beat him in that. At the time, it was like a shootout thing, and you had to set the fastest laps on a number of different tracks in a Peugeot. And so I beat him to that. He has subsequently forged his own path separately, picked up a sponsor, and put himself into the series that I just mentioned, British GT and then VLN. And by self-funding, or his sponsor funding him for a drive in VLN in a GT3 car, he went and put it on pole, I believe, in his first race amongst a load of factory drivers.
Always looks good.
Showed very, very well in the race, immediately was picked up as a BMW factory driver, and is now, since then, has won a load of other races, now an Aston Martin factory driver racing in Le Mans series. So those opportunities are there. But you need to be able to put yourself in front of those factory teams, basically.
Well, also, you skipped the bit where he gets that sponsor, which is a dark art in itself.
Yes, exactly, and that's and the guy did a very, very good job there. There's a lot of hard work's gone on with him behind the scenes, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there is a little bit of being in the right place at the right time and meeting the right person. But yeah, you need to be able to have that initial opportunity to show how good you are. And obviously, the longer that opportunity is and the more practice you get, the better job you'll do when you do get in front of the bigger teams. So yeah. So anyway, yeah. So if you could just put me in that time machine with a with a couple of £1 million, that'd be excellent. Thank you.
I'm working on it. Everyone, search Brad Philpot on Twitter and Bradley Philpot on YouTube, and you'll find that great content. But the links will be in the show notes below. Brad, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Spanners.
That's all we've got time for this week's magazine show. But as Brad said, we encourage everybody to turn a wheel. So there's opportunities to come and do that with us at Missed Apex Podcast. September 3rd, you can come on track at Buckmore Park. It's from mid-afternoon to evening, and then we go into the bar and back to a hotel and have some food and some drinks. But you can be wheel to wheel with me, with Brad Philpot, with Kyle Power, with Matt Trumpets, and a couple of other people. Catman is there on track as well, and also Chris Stevens is giving live commentary throughout, and we produce some brilliant videos of the day too. So go to missedapexpodcast.com/karting. It is starting to fill up. Now is the time to book, or at least express interest. And if you want to get involved in sim racing with us, if you're an iRacing person, then email racecontrol@missedapex.net, and we'll get you enrolled in our next season of the Missed Apex iRacing Cup, which will be starting in September as well. But wherever we see you next, work hard, be kind, and have fun. This was Missed Apex Podcast.